For our WOW seminar series, and it gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce Giles Hirst, Professor Giles Hirst, who is going to talk to us all about some interesting aspects around leadership today. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I'll be taking tips, Giles, don't worry. And Giles is at the Research School of Management at ANU University in Canberra. So I look forward to hearing what he says. And if you type your comments, any comments or questions in the comment box, I'll keep an eye on those. And we'll also have a question and answer session at the end. So over to you, Giles. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your very nice words, Paula, and a great privilege to be part of the WOW Group seminar series. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just start to share the content and let me know if I've given you the full screen. I'm hoping I have done. Yeah. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the land of the Ngunnawal people and leaders past, present and emerging. And hopefully you can see my screen and let me know if you can't.
Yep, all good.
So the purpose of this presentation is to make a case that we need to refocus the role of leaders as the proactive soul and focal influencers, to make the case that they're not always just the developers, but they're also the developees that might benefit from those who work for them. And so if you don't mind, I'll take us through a bit of a presentation on that. It is very much a developmental presentation, and I'd love to get your feedback and comments anywhere in the section. I'm sure it will make it a lot better through that experience and all your advice. So please call out if you have any questions whatsoever anywhere in the session. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to this very lively group, having met many of you in different contexts before this. So just a little bit about me, and thank you. A couple of things. I am very happily have a young son. Felt lucky in love in recent years, and very happy to be as a father. And in my spare time, obviously doing a lot less of it now with current contexts. I love surfing, and in between that, I've tended to focus on three streams of research, whether it's creativity, leadership, and societally focused research. For those early career researchers amongst you, I'd suggest one of the learnings I have is perhaps you could be a little bit more focused than I have been. I think I've learned some, enjoyed doing a lot of really interesting research, but some of the stuff has had variable experiences, and I always suggest don't let the projects choose you, you choose your projects. And so I want to talk about some projects I'm really passionate about here today. Loving different areas of research, but particularly being focused on these three streams. And today what I want to talk to you about is leadership. And I really want to pull it back straight to the core of what we talk about in terms of leadership. And these are two definitions from two founding figures in the field. And basically they make the point, and you might be asking, why are we getting to these fundamentals, the 101 of leadership? Well, what I want to do is talk to you about how these ways we look at leadership, how we define it, how we describe it, have effectively influenced some of the questions we study, and make a case that we need to probably look at it in a different way, look at some other aspects of what is important about being a leader to get a more broader and ultimately accurate view of leadership. So leadership is tended to be described as leaders being the influencers who influence over other people. They're the ones that engage others and enable them to contribute to broader goals. Well, you might say, well, what's controversial about this? What I'm going to make the case is that leadership, while it is exercised over others, leaders also are not always the proactive focal influencers. They're often reactive. While they may help contribute to organisational goals, equally beyond some of the more delirious and negative aspects of leadership, like abusive supervision, to the very best intentions, they may actually undermine organisational outcomes. And rather than see them as the sole source and the sole direction of development being from leaders to followers, we might also have the converse, that leaders can benefit in their own capabilities from followers, and not just from followers' outputs, but in terms of their insights and learnings. So I want to present three loosely related studies that talk about the process of leading innovation. They're connected by the process of leading innovation, but they particularly, more substantively, importantly, tackle a series of themes which is contrary to the flow of traffic, what we look at in leadership. And I want to get my mea culpa in here early as possible. When I look at my own research, I did a quick count this morning, 93% of my own leadership literature actually has initially been guilty of looking at what I call the predominant flow of leadership. And it's only recently I've started to argue and look at why we might need to make the case for other aspects of leadership and be important. So, and I hope you can hear me clearly. So in the first study, I want to talk about how a lot of what happens in the leadership role, and if you've led large groups, and Paula talked about very eloquently, I hope there's some lessons we might discuss and share here as a leader of a large group. Of course, setting the strategic directions and the vision for and the goals for the schools and units is something leaders might do, but equally and equally also know that there's a lot of stuff that we respond to as leaders, that whether you're leading a small unit or right up to the Prime Minister, we heard Malcolm Turnbull talk about this, there are a lot of playground things that go on where leaders have members of their team doing certain things, and rather than actually initiating that, they're responding to that, they're reacting to that. Equally, we know that while leadership is often a force for good, there are often influences that are outside workplaces that are maybe in the workplace boundaries, but also at home, where leaders may actually reinforce those negative experiences. And the third is we often talk about leaders, how they develop followers. What about how they develop through followers, how followers can enrich and benefit leaders' own thinking and particularly their own creativity in this context? So I want to talk about these three studies and how they actually encourage us collectively to recast some of the aspects of leadership that we take for granted. So I hope that's okay. Call out if there's any questions you have as I'm going through this, please. So the first study with Julia, Eric, and Andrew is one where we were struck by a couple of things. In this research, one of the themes that I'm always surprised when I work with organisations doing lots of different programs with large organisations, government, multinationals, is sometimes that good ideas, initiative, proactivity, and innovation surprisingly rejected. So I want to talk about kind of an example of this, which might be quite relevant today. It goes back some time. If we're looking at the pandemic, we know a couple of things. Well, obviously getting a shot in the arm is probably relevant, but also, it's quite intriguing despite all the technological advances, things like face masks and simply washing our hands through sanitizing are things that make a great difference. And so you might say, well, surely the inventor of and one of the pioneers of antiseptic hand washing would have been celebrated for their ideas and their organization. And that person, Ignaz Semmelweis, is known as one of the physicians who pioneered this concept, the idea of using antiseptic as a modern medical practice. And basically what he did was he advocated we need to do this regularly. And as a consequence of doing these practices, he was able to reduce in the wards that he was working in mortality rates for a different type of epidemic, perpetual fever. And he managed to drop mortality rates by 90%, from 18.3% to less than 2% in less than 6 months. And having presented that data and those results to his superiors, you might have thought, well, surely the guy was hailed as a genius, seen as a real formative figure and a catalyst for doing things better in his organisation. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. In fact, his superiors rejected his idea. The leader rejected them. And actually, it got to a stage where he was eventually got to publishing a series of vitriolic letters to his community, to his medical community, to his supervisors, and to his hospital managers. So much so that he was sent to a sane asylum, and 2 weeks later, after a violent conflict, actually died. So it was quite shocking to us to see this kind of example, but it's not alone, and that's in many ways the inspiration for our research. Is if we see good employee behaviours, we see leaders and we see employees taking charge in organisations, how do we empower them, and how do we understand when organisations and leaders may not necessarily do that? And so in our research in this paper, what we wanted to look at was, what about leaders that are engaging in boundary spanning? Employees engaging in boundary spanning. That's when they're seeking advice across organisational boundaries. They're speaking to people outside their group and connecting knowledge, seeking information, cross-fertiling ideas from other areas. So if you're in the WOW group, it might be you talking to different people in engineering, health, medicine. And what we know is that behaviour is the fundamental lifeblood of ideas in organisations. There's a huge body of literature, so over some 30 years, that has constantly and very successfully documented the benefits of boundary spanning to performance, creativity, innovation, not just for the individual, but also for the teams and equally the organisations in which these people work for. So it's not surprisingly, a lot of researchers identified how we can fix it, how we can enable it, and clearly supervisors play a key role. So it's a very well-trodden path for research looking at that. And so a great deal of research has looked at how supervisors can foster employee boundary spanning. But very little actually is asked whether supervisors actually want it, which is kind of surprising, because if you worked in large multinationals, early in my career, I worked for KPMG Consulting, and if you span outside your organisational boundaries, people often ask you, did you, what's your chargeabilities? And partners often used to say, what else? What are you doing out in that other group? And so rather than being rewarded, often, it was surprising to me, and I'm not sure if I'm alone, but in this research we found quite a lot of consistency actually, that organisations are fundamentally territorial. We applied territoriality theory, a very nice management theory that helps to understand these relationships. So rather than being encouraged, boundary spanning is actually poses a bit of a challenge if you're a supervisor or a manager. So let me explain that, and let me talk about that if you don't mind. Well, according to territorial theory, that managers effectively are rewarded for overseeing a group. Their performance is not just their own activities, actually the outputs and the collective contribution of the unit they see. Through their leadership role, the identity in serving as a leader, they tend to develop strong relationships with that group and the employees within it. And they tend to develop a sense of their self-esteem and self-concept being embedded in this group. And effectively, what boundary spanning does, where someone goes and talks to people outside outside their group, effectively weakens that control. Now, weakening control, might not necessarily be a negative thing. In fact, to be quite harmless. Yet, by equal measure, boundary spanning, where someone is off your zone of influence, is inherently laden with ambiguity. You don't know what the person's doing. And so at some level, leaders have to make an attribution about what that behavior is. Is it a positive behavior that should be rewarded and endorsed, or something that's negative that should be undermined and discouraged? And so what we want to do is look at the conditions where supervisors were likely to make a negative attribution, to perceive harmful intent. And so in a series of studies, we argued, well, a key factor in that was if the employee was seeking their supervisor's advice. There's a key moderator in the sense that when leaders were, when employees were failing to seek their leader's advice, thereby showing, if not deference, certainly respect for their leader, the value of their perspective, and the benefits of listening to them, leaders were more likely to perceive this as a negative behaviour and perceive actually harmful as the intent was going on. And so as a consequence of that, in two interrelated studies, two complementary studies. In the first study, we looked at employees' boundary spanning behaviour, and we looked at whether they engaged in upward advice seeking. We found when they didn't engage in upward advice seeking, they're more likely to perceive they're undermined. In the second set of studies, we looked at the supervisor's perspective. We looked at over 300 or so different employees in that study, 410, sorry. In the second study, 410 managers, and said, okay, so what happens if you have an employee's boundary spanning? And what happens when they're either engaging in advice seeking or not? And what we found was when the combination of engaging in boundary spanning but not seeking advice, there was significant negative recriminatory undermining effects that the supervisor engaged in, not just discouraging, but devaluing what is essentially beneficial behaviour by the employee and devaluing the employee's actions and the employee itself. So that was kind of an interesting start for us in this research line. And it helped frame a couple of things. I'm going to just talk briefly about what this was. Is it, it repositioned leaders as actually responding to different behaviours. They're not, and we hear a lot about leaders having to manage conflict in their groups, the different potentially challenging behaviours, political infighting, different perspectives. And in many ways, they're not always the focal influences. They might actually be coming in after the event as the emergency ambulance, trying to pick the pieces up. And so they're not just proactive, they might be reactive. And while these processes may mean to fixing, in the case of conflict, leaders fixing negative behaviours, we also know from these theories, logically, there are reasons why leaders may actually undermine good behaviour. And so this is kind of different from our 101 definitions of leadership. And in this second, and I want to talk about another study that takes us another step further, looking at how leaders might influence things and may actually even undermine behaviours that don't even occur in work, that occur a long way away from work. And I should just actually also add a further point. I'm just going to give an overview of these three studies. So if you do want to ask questions anywhere, or you want me to come back with more detail, don't hesitate. I'll certainly do my best and delighted to do so. So please call out. The second study is looking at actually what happens a long way from work, what happens from our experiences with our parents. And in many ways, it's a bit of an ethnographic study, not just for myself, but also for my PhD student, Sonia, who led this project, Sonia Lin Shen, where we both became parents through this process, working with Xiaofei Wu, Cynthia Lee, Wu Wen, and Chang Sisi. A really nice experience working with them as a team. And in this research, we're inspired by the idea that, what is it to be good parents? We want the best for our children, but when are we maybe pushing them too much? When are our expectations really not necessarily helping them? And how does that impact them through life? And of course, with the theme of leadership, how do we as leaders maybe when we take off our parental hat, what do we do as leaders in the workplace, and how does that maybe interact with the developmental workplace intersection? So I want to talk about how this occurs. And we know that perfectionism is becoming increasingly legitimized. It's increasingly common and increasingly expected in many walks of life. There's a very nice review conducted by Camillo Acampo. I'd encourage you to read it. It's a really good piece of research. So in this study, we looked at how, and there's probably a bit of differences between whether it's excessive expectations or perfectionism. Sonia likes to call it tiger parenting. I prefer excessive expectations, but the truth is somewhere between them. What we did measure is high expectations. So these are excessive expectations. And what we argued is that when parents have excessive expectations on their children, they're demanding the perfect performance every time. It's an unreasonable standard, and there's no way anyone can ever live up to that. And this creates a sense of fear that one is going to fail, but also be criticized for failing, and experience the shame in many ways when our most vulnerable and formative stages, when we're children, but even later through life, feel the sense of helplessness, that we cannot meet our parents' expectations. And so as a consequence, this encourages risk-averse behaviour, which discourages creativity. And it's a social learning perspective. And if we think about how schemas are reinforced through life, when someone experiences those excessive expectations, those perfectionist expectations, that in turn reinforces or evokes those early experiences. So we argue that strengthens that earlier relationship. So what you might expect is not necessarily a fundamentally negative behaviour from supervisors, but not necessarily a good one, clearly can have serious deleterious effects, particularly if someone has been, whether not necessarily traumatised, but certainly challenged by these early experiences with their parents. And so we conducted this research in two different contexts. We studied 214 different employees in the US, admittedly as a pilot study, same source, but then we replicated this again with 3 different sources of data from supervisors, employees, and a nice piece, I think, is we actually got parental data from this. And what we found was support for this process, support for the moderated mediation model, in the fact that parental expectations consistently created a fear of failure, and a fear of failure then undermined creativity. And those effects were strongest when people then had a reinforcing experience of supervisors doing similar things, imposing these excessive expectations. So if you can see from this figure, and let me know if I'm moving too fast, I want to really try and make sure I stick to my time. When leaders are high on PSE, which is perfectionist supervisor expectations, this means that the earlier parental perfectionism has a stronger relationship with fear of failure. So if you have not just perfectionist parents, but you also experience a perfectionist supervisor, this has a double whammy effect, so that you are increasingly likely to fear failure, and so reinforcing negative experiences, and so decreasing your own creativity even further. So we see in this context that while we've seen these definitions previously of leaders in encouraging creativity, they also might, with no necessarily negative intent, might also discourage it. Now you might be saying with these first 2 studies, okay, well, this is kind of risky territory, Giles. You're almost preaching the black Bible of leadership. You're a professor of leadership, and you might want to be careful here. You might be talking yourself out of your own paycheck. So I want to kind of, if you don't mind, provide some answers about what might be happening if leaders aren't the centre of everything, and how we might think about this more constructively. And I want to flip the script, if you want to call it that. So in doing so, a lot of the research talks about leaders developing followers, but let's consider the converse scenario, where we've got followers that are particularly capable, and you might have them in your own teams as a leader, leading a very talented group and WOW group, and knowing you've got some really good researchers from other Queensland universities here as well. You might have really good talented people who work with you, and by nature of seniority, a lot of the things we do are a lot less about getting the sandpit, but actually helping people build the sandcastles. And so we can help them build the sandcastles. We can also potentially learn from that process as well. So let's talk about how we might think about how leaders can not just benefit from employee skills, but can develop themselves. So in this paper, with Xiaofei Wu, George, myself and Dan, Sun and Long Zhang, we looked at this question. We looked at how can team members, rather than leaders benefit team member creativity, how can team members benefit that? And why might this be significant? Well, by and large, as I said, the dominant flow of traffic is that virtually everything in the creativity domain of supervisor creativity looks at leaders essentially being the stimulants of the bright shoots in organizations. They're the ones that water the talent, create the gardens, and as a consequence, the flowers grow. Yet, if we do that, we kind of overlook some potential opportunities of innovation in organisations. And that's strategically important to consider those opportunities, not least as leaders often are in the control of resources and play a critical role in decision making about what goes ahead and what doesn't. So having leaders that are creative often may be a very powerful way of sparking innovation in organisations. So in this study, we wanted to unpack bottom-up influences rather than looking at the top-down focus, which has been the predominant approach. Look at what kinds of team behaviours can actually promote creativity in leaders, and how do leaders benefit from these experiences? So why they benefit, and what are the processes that lead to them benefiting? What are the cognitive processes, and who is most likely to benefit? Is it those that see themselves as the grand leaders, the most confident ones, or those that actually are potentially most in need of that stimulation, that benefit most from that kind of inspiration from their employees? And so what we did in this research is we applied information elaboration theory. And the argument from this theory is that essentially what happens is the diversity and richness of knowledge, when you have a team where people are offering diverse views, they're expressing different ideas, and they're constructively sharing that information. So there's a whole range of ideas being cross-fertilized, different perspectives being shared, and different ways of looking at people has been discussed, voiced, and negotiated. That effectively provides a very rich environment, and leaders, as a consequence of benefiting from and facilitating those discussions, become more elaborate in their processing. They connect different dots, they connect different ideas, they might challenge their fundamental assumptions, they may look at problems more differently, and this becomes a potent catalyst stimulating creativity. And so their ideas ultimately become far richer, far novel, and far more useful. Our second aspect of this research is we said, okay, well, who's going to benefit from that? Well, one of the key things we know from creativity is your self-concept, your self-efficacy. What we found is that, and what we argue is that leaders that are potentially low on this self-concept are more likely to benefit. They're more likely to be needed to having compensatory support. A recent publication we published in JAP makes the case that it substitutes for a potential limitation in their own self-concept, their own self-belief. And so as a consequence, those leaders are more likely to engage in information encoding, which then in turn has a great benefit for the quality of their own ideas and creativity. We tested this in a series of studies. I won't go into all the studies. We went through a very detailed validation process, got data from Australia, Japan, and also some from Europe, and tested the empirical study in this design here. We worked with 316 different team members, 79 team leaders. We had reasonably decent team sizes, and we had a pretty nice design in the sense we had team members rating the inputs, and a longitudinal aspect of leaders rating the moderators and mediators. And so we also had the next level up rating their leaders' creativity. So we had 3 different sources of data in this study. We had a number of controls, and we had pretty reasonable support for the model. We had moderated mediation, and so I'll just show you the kind of the key interaction. And what we found, with consistent with what we're thinking of, was that teams where leaders' creative competence or the self-belief in themselves was low, those leaders benefited the most from that rich environment, and they're more likely to benefit. And that's kind of an important finding, is that a lot of what happens in organizations about developing leaders is about developing people might call high potentials, the very talented leaders. But what happens to those leaders that don't see themselves, or maybe don't have the confidence to place themselves in that group? Well, this is really important. It says a really powerful leadership mechanism is actually those who work for you. And it's really useful in the sense that it's certainly more cost effective, but it means that if you're looking at your bench strength, that actually encouraging those contexts where there's fertile environments and placing leaders strategic in those groups might be a really good way of enriching the leadership capabilities and the leadership ultimately bench strength to benefiting those who most develop from that intellectual stimulation. So it's important this also in the context of our broader discussion that it says that leadership certainly benefits employees, but leaders don't just empower, they are certainly enriched and far more creative in their thinking when we think about contexts that benefit them. And this is, as I said, if we go back to our original definition, a recasting, if you think of these three studies, that while we've traditionally framed leadership as being over people, the truth of the matter is it's not. Leadership is a bi-directional process. It's a co-constructed by its very nature, knowing that social identity theories have done a much better job than traditional leadership research here. So it's truly co-constructed. And while it is mobilizing others, it's also responding to them. And while we might want leaders to enable organizational success, and they certainly do in very many cases, they certainly can also undermine it. And we need to understand where the psychological processes and the structures of organizations get in the way of leaders doing a great job. And this also leads to us thinking about leadership differently. And I'm just going to show two kind of quick pictures, knowing that I'm going to try and stick to time here. And they're not perfect pictures, but I'm going to encourage us to think a little bit laterally about what leadership is when we think about these data points. That maybe leadership is an embedded form. Leader is embedded as a bi-directional process. Leaders might be influencing, if we're thinking that as a central dot in this figure, as a yellow dot, they might be influencing things, but they're also putting the jigsaw together based on the pieces their followers give them, the skills their followers have, the actions of the followers. So truly is a bi-directional process. They might ultimately, if we're looking at these models, be embedded in networks. I'm cautious about showing this slide because if we think about a leader in this figure as the dark grey dot, they're influenced by many influences. And while social networks are important, it's not the only thing I want to emphasize in this research. Leaders certainly are influenced by their own leaders, those at the top of the organization, but they're influenced, if you think about this dark grey dot, by line relationships with their peers, and they certainly benefit by the yellow dots by their subordinates who work for them. And we've only looked at these flows of influences in certain directions, and we certainly need to expand that. So if we start to look at leadership as a co-constructed process, not as a sole influences, but embedded in a broader context where it's reactive as well as proactive, it starts to get us to look at some different questions. And so let me make a case about how we might really think about in broadening our vision of leadership according to that. Well, we've traditionally seen, as you know, as I've said a couple of times in this presentation, that leaders are the focal actor. Well, the issue is that by nature, as you move up the pyramid, leadership is less about doing the work than making the conditions for it to happen. And we've traditionally thought about making those conditions about empowering people to get the people who work for us to do the best. But what about actually imbibing those insights ourselves, that actually those insights make us maybe more proactive, certainly more creative as leaders ourselves. And that leadership, we're hearing over 2/3 of managers' time is dealing with the playground effect. If you ask past Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, that much of his time was reacting to things. What about putting some time to understanding that? If that's an important aspect of why a manager's time is occupied, whether it's from the front line to right to the top of our nation, surely that's something we want to consider. And by and large, leadership has been a study of line-based influence. I saw a recent publication coming out in Leadership Quarterly last night where they talked about these influences. That's really important. Leaders are embedded in social networks, but they also have important phenomena that go on when we look at tournaments or good relationships between peer leaders that are really important. I had the privilege of reviewing a really nice thesis where a group of scholars were looking at how peer or competitive leaders might be actually destabilizing each other. And so we need to open that envelope to look at those different questions. Equally, we've tended to look at leadership as trickling down organisations, that leadership flows and cascades down that. Well, that's fundamentally, if you're saying, what about the bulk of our leaders in organisations? That's fundamentally problematic. If we know that most organisations, the biggest group in those organisations are middle managers, well, we effectively degrade them and consign them to a role of simply being implementers, of not being influencers or filters of the process, and even active agents in the process. So maybe we need to relook at the much maligned look of middle managers and recast them. And the final thing is, if we think about what has been extolled in strategic leadership, is that leaders are the centre of leadership speeches, leadership language is the centre about what goes on, ultimately the bottom line. Well, that's great if you've got great leaders, but we also know that that's not always the case in the executive suite, nor is it the case in any suite. And bad apples can lead to rotten barrels. So if we have bad apples in the executive suite, well, there's a whole lot of things that can go on. And if you're looking at organisations implementing precarious workplace practices, we've recently published an AMR on, that's not necessarily the behaviours we want to encourage. And so we do need upward influences. We do need influence groups, whether it's unions, whistleblowers, subordinate resistance. And we need to understand those sources where followers are actually resisting leadership for good. Now, those are the implications for theory and research development. What about practice? Let me just give a quick 2 cents. If leadership is previously about leaders being the center of leadership influence and directing and mobilizing, motivating, press ganging, persuading, influencing others, then the prototypical leader by the zero-sum analysis is a leader that's a great leader, the leader that can achieve incredible things. And if you're looking at the prototype of that leader, the leader where everyone else in the green team is failing, and if we're in the red team, we're succeeding above the odds, I'm not sure if that kind of leader is the one we want. The nice thing I might say in closing this presentation is that drawing on a practical example, and you might say where it's not a case of life imitating art, in this case it's a case of management research also converging on political science. If you look at some very nice research looking at the very top, where political science have looked at the very best of leadership in Australia, what's particularly interesting is that it aligns with this way of thinking. In the sense, if you look at who have been seen as our greatest prime ministers by eminent political scientists and historians, you look at the key characteristics of those great leaders. I've just got two that represent different sides of the political division. A lot of their work, with the exception maybe of a policy legacy, is actually their relational behaviours, building good relationships, building good interactions, and interacting with different stakeholders, both leading them, but also responding to them. And so truly, these are leaders that built those consensuses, built good relationships, and responded to those influences upwards and downwards, if you like to say that. And you might say that's perhaps a message we might want to consider today, if we're looking at where we are. Is maybe good leadership about aligning all those influences across different parts of our country, the different views of different leaders we have, and getting that consensus. So I hope we can think about leadership as a more relational and collective process, because it's certainly a very important thing. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to come virtually to you. As I was saying to Paula, we hope you come to Canberra sometime. Don't believe the hype. People say it's a boring place, but truly it's a beautiful place. We have great scholars at ANU. It's a privilege to present to you today, and we'd certainly love to host you anytime when you'd like to come and visit.